The first time I tell you this story, it will feel unreal. But pay attention. Blackwater Mill is not just a place on a map. It is a scar etched into time itself, a location where history refused to move, where the clocks all froze at the exact same second. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the entire world had a different pulse, a heartbeat suspended. On a fog-choked morning in 1927, every clock in Blackwater Mill stopped. Not an hour off. Not minutes. Precisely at 9:17 a.m. And that same morning, 17 children vanished without a trace. Their disappearance was so complete, so surgically precise, that even the town's adults, the ones who claimed to know every shadowed corner, couldn't explain it. It was as if someone had pulled a thread in reality itself, unraveling it only for that town, for that day. No evidence remained. No footprints, no ransom note, no struggle. Just silence, and an empty wind that whispered through the abandoned mills like it was aware of its own complicity. Blackwater Mill is a lesson in control, in unseen power. Because when the clock stopped, it wasn't just time that was arrested, it was human agency. The children didn't vanish randomly. They were taken from the rhythm of the world, removed from the ordinary flow of life, and cast into a system far beyond what anyone in that town could comprehend. You need to understand this. The story you've heard, the sanitized version in history books, the local legends whispered around campfires, is a lie. Every narrative you've been fed has been designed to calm you, to make you think the world is safe, predictable, and just. But Blackwater Mill teaches you otherwise. It reminds you that there are forces that can manipulate time, perception, and life itself, leaving behind only questions, and the unbearable weight of knowing you were never meant to know. So lean in. Let the unease settle into your bones, because by the end of this story, you'll see that what happened at Blackwater Mill is not merely a tragedy of the past. It is a blueprint, a whisper of a reality most men never dare to confront. To understand Blackwater Mill, you must first understand what it was before the silence. On paper, it was nothing special, another industrial town carved into existence by water, iron, and obedient labor. The mill dominated everything. It decided when men woke, when they ate, when they slept, and when they broke. The river fed the gears fed the town, and the town fed something far older than profit. Generations worked there without questioning why certain rooms were locked, why certain supervisors never aged, why the mill bell sometimes rang when no shift was scheduled. Children grew up with the sound of grinding stone in their ears, learning discipline before curiosity, obedience before thought. This is important. Control systems never begin with force. They begin with routine, with structure, with comfort disguised as necessity. In the years leading up to 1927, strange patterns began to emerge. Teachers reported children falling asleep at the same hour every day, regardless of hunger or rest. Mothers complained of identical dreams, black water, turning wheels, a voice counting slowly backward. Fathers noticed their sons and daughters standing still for long moments, eyes unfocused, as if listening to instructions no one else could hear. And always, the mill kept expanding. New underground channels, new chambers for maintenance, new clocks installed everywhere, schoolhouses, churches, even private homes, donated by the mill owners themselves. Identical clocks, same make, same internal mechanism, all synchronized weekly. The town called it generosity. But synchronization is not charity. It is alignment. Here is a truth most men never consider. Timekeeping has always been a weapon. Whoever controls the clock controls behavior, sleep cycles, labor output, attention, even belief. Ancient priesthoods understood this. Empires enforced it. Blackwater Mill perfected it. The children weren't just living in the town. They were being tuned to it, conditioned to its rhythm like instruments waiting to be played. When the disappearance finally happened, it felt sudden only because the groundwork had been laid so quietly. That morning, witnesses claimed the air felt heavier, like the pressure before a storm. Dogs refused to move. Birds abandoned the riverbanks. And then, 9:17 a.m., every clock stopped. Not because they broke, because they were commanded to. And in that frozen second, the town's most malleable minds were removed from the surface world. Ask yourself this. How does an entire town lose 17 children without resistance? The answer is simple and terrifying. By the time it happened, Blackwater Mill no longer belonged to the people. The people belonged to the system. And systems like that never dissipate. They only change names. Most historians will tell you the children were lost to tragedy, to accident, or to folklore. Don't believe them. Tragedy leaves evidence. Folklore leaves exaggeration. Blackwater Mill left precision. Every room examined, every street scoured, every inch of the riverbank, clean. Nothing. The adults didn't panic the way you'd expect. They were hushed, almost rehearsed in their confusion, as if someone had prepared them for this moment decades before. Some called it grief. I call it conditioning. A town mold to comply even when its own flesh disappeared. But here's the detail that most will never tell you. The disappearance was not the first anomaly. Reports exist, hidden in local archives, dismissed by bureaucrats, of children vanishing temporarily, only to reappear hours later, pale, silent, changed. They refused to eat, to speak, to play. Teachers noted that some stared at empty corners of classrooms for minutes at a time, following invisible patterns. Entire families described waking to find beds empty, only to have the children return as if nothing had happened. These moments were precursors, training sessions. The system was testing its reach, its ability to remove and retain life at will. Blackwater Mill wasn't a mill. It was a laboratory, a cathedral of control. The mill owners, names lost to public memory, but they were not ordinary men. They were scholars of secrecy, inheritors of forbidden knowledge. Their diaries, when found decades later, were filled with arcane symbols, diagrams mapping human behavior as one might map a river or forest. One entry reads, and I quote, "The child's mind is clay, we carve while they dream." This wasn't metaphor. It was methodology. They understood the power of anticipation, the leverage of fear, and the obedience that arises when life itself is structured as a series of commands. They were sculpting the next generation, not just for labor, but for something else, something hidden behind ritual, hierarchy, and authority so subtle it went unnoticed by the very families it ensnared. By 1927, the children had been conditioned for the ultimate extraction. What happened that morning was the final act of a long experiment in absolute psychological mastery. And here's the darkest truth you need to hear. The system did not end. It merely went dormant. Like seeds buried in soil, the methods, the patterns, the knowledge of behavioral control survived, ready to be applied whenever the right environment arose. Blackwater Mill was never about an accident. It was about revelation, teaching those who were paying attention that obedience is engineered, that reality can be bent, and that human lives are the raw material of power. The question now is simple: are you paying attention? Because understanding this is not just historical curiosity. It is survival. There's a moment in every forbidden system where secrecy becomes heavier than truth, where the architects of control realize they must either reveal themselves or erase witnesses. Blackwater Mill crossed that threshold years before the children vanished. What the town never noticed, because they were never meant to notice, was the quiet replacement of authority. Local officials began answering to unseen committees. Church sermons shifted from salvation to obedience. School lessons stopped encouraging curiosity and began rewarding repetition. Even language changed. Words like why and how faded, replaced by when and how long. This wasn't coincidence. It was cultural engineering. And once a culture is engineered, resistance feels unnatural. Buried beneath the mill's main floor was a network of chambers that did not appear on any blueprint. Workers occasionally spoke of staircases that led nowhere, doors that opened only at certain hours, and humming sounds that vibrated through bone rather than air. Engineers called it water pressure. Men who stayed too long down there described something else, a rhythm that made thinking difficult, a pulse that encouraged surrender. Ancient civilizations knew this trick well. Sound, repetition, and confinement can alter perception, induce trance, and collapse the sense of self. Blackwater Mill simply refined the process with industrial efficiency. And then there were the visitors. Men who arrived without luggage and left without names. They wore no uniforms, claimed no affiliations, but everyone felt their presence. Conversations stopped when they entered rooms. Clerks signed papers they didn't remember reading. These weren't overseers in the traditional sense. They were auditors, observers of compliance, measuring how deeply the system had rooted itself into the human psyche. When children began reporting dreams of underground holes and turning wheels, The visitors stayed longer. When parents stopped questioning the mill's authority, they smiled. The town was passing its test. By the time 1927 arrived, Blackwater Mill had achieved something rare and dangerous, a closed-loop society. Every institution reinforced the same doctrine: trust the system, surrender to routine, doubt yourself before you doubt authority. That morning at 9:17, the final protocol was initiated. The clock stopped not as a malfunction, but as a signal. Time itself became an order. In that suspended second, the children, already synchronized, already conditioned, responded to a command the adults could not hear. They walked. They followed. They obeyed. This is the part that changes men. Because once you understand how easily an entire town was reshaped without violence, you start seeing the same architecture everywhere. Different names. Different symbols. Same mechanisms. Blackwater Mill wasn't an isolated horror. It was a prototype. And prototypes are never built to remain unique. Now imagine standing in the mill that morning, not as a child, but as an observer. The machinery still whirring, the water rushing through iron channels, the town unaware of the invisible hand guiding their lives. You would notice the silence first. Not a distant quiet, but a compression of sound, as if the very air had been thickened with expectation. And then you would see the children, not panicked, not running, but moving with purpose, faces blank yet unafraid, each step perfectly aligned with a rhythm only they could hear. This was not chaos. This was orchestration. The adults, meanwhile, experienced time differently. Clocks stopped, but perception continued. Minutes stretched and snapped like elastic, leaving witnesses disoriented, anxious, and helpless. Some reported seeing shadows flicker against walls, small figures darting into spaces that didn't exist. Others described a sensation of being watched, not by humans, but by awareness itself. It is difficult to convey what it feels like to witness a disappearance that is absolute, precise, and entirely lawful in the eyes of a system the mind cannot comprehend. That day, Blackwater Mill didn't just take children, it demonstrated a principle. Control without violence is more terrifying than control enforced by brutality. Consider the implication. Systems of control are most effective when their victims accept them voluntarily. Every fear, every routine, every expectation the mill imposed had trained the children to comply, to respond predictably. And when the moment arrived, resistance was obsolete. No screams, no rebellion, no struggle, just a silent passage into the unknown. This is what makes Blackwater Mill unique. It was both laboratory and execution chamber, classroom and crucible, teaching a lesson that no adult in that town was prepared to hear. And here's where most people stumble. They believe the power lay in the disappearance itself. They are wrong. The power was in the preparation. Years of subtle conditioning, subtle nudges, invisible hierarchies shaping thought and action without being questioned. By the time the clock stopped, the mill had already claimed the children. The act of removal was simply a demonstration, a final signature on a process decades in the making. Understand this, because it is crucial. Control of a human mind does not require chains, threats, or blood. It requires design, repetition, and timing. And when you see it executed with the precision of Blackwater Mill, you recognize the terrifying potential lying dormant in any structured system. The men behind Blackwater Mill were not ordinary industrialists. They were scholars of hidden systems, practitioners of influence that predates written history. Their knowledge came not from textbooks or science journals, but from forbidden tomes, secret lodges, and ancestral instruction. They studied the mind as one studies a machine, mapping impulses, reactions, and obedience like coordinates on a chart. Fear was only a tool, habit was the real weapon, and their greatest achievement was not in the disappearance itself, but in the creation of a society willing to comply without question. They were meticulous. Every bell, every schedule, every ritual in the town had a purpose. Church sermons reinforced submission. School lessons suppressed curiosity. Even playtime was structured to cultivate predictability. Adults unwittingly became cogs, reinforcing the system for the next generation. No one questioned because no one remembered a world outside the rhythm. By 1927, the mill was a perfect organism of obedience. And like any predator, the architects of this system struck when the moment was right. But why children? Why take the young, impressionable minds first? Because control is easiest at its inception. The adult mind resists, it questions, rebels, and remembers. The child's mind is clay. Once shaped, it can adapt to any order, any rhythm, any directive without hesitation. And the children of Blackwater Mill were already trained, already synchronized with the pulse of the system. The disappearance wasn't a tragedy. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept for something far larger, far older, and far more dangerous than any local legend could convey. This is where history and mythology intersect. The methods the mill owners used mirror rituals and psychological practices from forgotten civilizations. Ancient priests moved populations without force. Kings controlled empires through rhythm and repetition. Orders were obeyed because systems were internalized, because minds were tuned to anticipate commands. Blackwater Mill is simply the modern echo of these techniques. It proves what men like us have long suspected. The true power is invisible, psychological, and institutional. And here's the point you need to hear. Understanding this knowledge is not harmless. Once you see how obedience is manufactured, once you perceive the scaffolding beneath every routine, you can never unsee it. You will notice systems, hierarchies, and rhythms that govern your own life. And that is why this story is dangerous. Because knowledge is the beginning of awakening, and awakening comes with a cost. Beneath the grinding wheels and iron beams of Blackwater Mill lay a hidden labyrinth, a network of tunnels and chambers no worker was meant to find. These passages were not for maintenance. They were sanctuaries of control, laboratories of manipulation, theaters of psychological mastery. The floors were etched with symbols, some geometric, some arcane, all designed to influence perception. Air currents carried sound in ways that disoriented the uninitiated. Shadows moved where no one should be. Every element of this subterranean world was a tool, a device to shape behavior without overt coercion. Children who ventured too close, or who were guided there, experienced something profound. Time seemed elastic, stretching and contracting. Light bent unnaturally. A whisper in one chamber could echo through another as if consciousness itself were being folded, redirected. Those who emerged from these passages were never quite the same. Their attention sharpened, but their will became malleable. These chambers were classrooms for compliance, proving that absolute control is cultivated, not imposed. And there is a pattern here that most miss. Every disappearance at Blackwater Mill followed preparation that was centuries in the making. The owners weren't improvising. They had inherited methods refined over generations, psychological conditioning, ritualized observation, environmental manipulation. Every structural choice in the mill, every scheduled bell, every lesson plan, every bedtime, was part of a broader program. The children were not kidnapped. They were extracted according to a precise algorithm designed to ensure total compliance. Consider this carefully. The corridors beneath the mill represent more than hidden rooms. They are a metaphor for power itself. The deeper you descend, the more removed you are from ordinary reality. The further you travel, the more the system can influence your perception, your memory, your choices. And that is precisely what happened on the day the clock stopped. The children, trained, guided, conditioned, were led down a path they would never forget, though the surface world would act as if nothing had occurred. This is why Blackwater Mill continues to fascinate and terrify. It is not just a story of vanished children. It is a blueprint for domination through subtlety. It proves that obedience can be engineered without force, that behavior can be predicted and directed with precision, and that the real disappearance, the erasure of autonomy, can occur in plain sight. The most chilling part of Blackwater Mill is not the disappearance itself. It is the psychological architecture that made it possible. The town had been carefully tuned for decades. Every habit, every expectation, every ritual designed to suppress doubt and foster compliance. Adults became complicit without realizing it, reinforcing routines that primed the next generation for extraction. This is the principle few dare to acknowledge. You don't need change to control a population. You need structure, repetition, and subtle manipulation of perception. The children were the apex of this system. Long before 1927, they had been conditioned to respond to signals no one else could detect. Bells, shadows, patterns of light, the cadence of footsteps, these were all triggers. Even the sound of synchronized clocks, ticking in perfect unison, played a role. Psychologists today would recognize this as classical conditioning taken to extremes, an environment designed to create predictable behavior, unwavering attention, and unquestioning obedience. The mill's operators understood that the mind is more pliable than the body, and that control of thought precedes control of action. Witnesses reported odd behaviors in the days before the disappearance. Children would pause mid-step, stare at empty spaces, or whisper words adults could not hear. Parents tried to rationalize it: illness, imagination, fatigue. But the truth was far more sinister. The children were rehearsing compliance, practicing a form of obedience drilled into them with invisible hands. Adults noticed these anomalies but dismissed them because the system had conditioned them to accept routine over scrutiny. Curiosity, after all, is dangerous where obedience is prized. Even the clocks themselves were part of the psychological strategy. Time is more than a measure. It is a tether, a regulator of expectation, a master of rhythm. When all clocks stopped at 9:17 a.m., it wasn't mechanical failure. It was a signal, a synchronized cue activating conditioning embedded in every child. Adults could only watch as the invisible order unfolded, powerless, unaware that the very concept of time had been weaponized against their children. This is the lesson Blackwater Mill imparts to anyone willing to pay attention. The most absolute control is invisible. It is a system embedded in culture, education, routine, and perception. And it works because those under its influence believe they are free. Once you grasp this truth, you begin to see the hidden architectures of control everywhere, in workplaces, schools, governments, and even within your own mind. Understanding this is dangerous, but ignorance is fatal. The machinery at Blackwater Mill was not merely functional, it was symbolic. Every wheel, gear, and piston carried meaning, designed to resonate with both the conscious and subconscious mind. Work is described feeling an odd rhythm in the vibrations, as if the iron and water themselves were speaking an unspoken language. Children, already conditioned by years of subtle cues, responded instinctively. Their movements, their attention, their very thoughts aligned with the mechanical pulse of the mill. This was no accident. It was deliberate. The mill had become both classroom and instrument, teaching obedience through its sound, its motion, its very presence. Even the layout of the machinery mattered. Large wheels dominated the central hole, like colossal eyes observing everything. Narrow channels led to shadowed corners where sound and light were manipulated to unsettle perception. Engineers who ventured too far reported dizziness, confusion, and a compulsion to follow a path they could not explain. For the children, these pathways were invisible guides, nudging them toward the underground chambers where the final phase of the program would unfold. Every gear, every shaft, every turning wheel was a psychological cue, conditioning bodies and minds to obey without question. And there were rituals, not the kind seen in textbooks, but subtle, encoded ceremonies. Weekly inspections, synchronized clock adjustments, bell chimes, and public exercises, all designed to reinforce the sense of order and hierarchy. Adults participated unwittingly, reinforcing the system for the children under their care. These rituals were the silent drumbeat of control, embedding obedience into daily life. By the time the day of the disappearance arrived, every participant in the town, from mill hands to mothers, had been unconsciously trained to maintain the structure that allowed the extraction to succeed. The symbolic weight of the machinery extended beyond psychology. Historical patterns suggest that cultures long before the industrial age recognized the power of ritualized environments. Temples, pyramids, and sacred halls were all designed to manipulate perception, to cultivate focus, and to enforce obedience. Blackwater Mill was simply the modern echo of that ancient wisdom. The owners were aware that architecture, rhythm, and environmental control could bend human behavior more effectively than brute force ever could. So understand this: the disappearance of the children was not a random event. It was the culmination of decades of engineering, ritual, and conditioning, a symphony of mechanical and psychological mastery. And it proves a truth that still resonates today: power, when wielded subtly, is invisible, unstoppable, and absolute. After the children vanished, the story of Blackwater Mill was quietly rewritten. Authorities arrived, investigators questioned witnesses, but records were vague, inconsistent, and deliberately incomplete. Reports disappeared, testimonies were altered, and anyone who pressed too hard found doors closing in their faces. The adults of the town, conditioned for decades, complied without question. They accepted the official line. The children had wandered off, perhaps drowned, perhaps taken by accident. They did not question, because questioning would have disrupted the rhythm they had been trained to maintain. This was no simple cover-up. It was a systemic reinforcement of obedience. The mill's owners understood that control does not end with the immediate target. It extends to witnesses, families, and the institutions that surround them. By erasing evidence and shaping narratives, they ensured that the very society around Blackwater Mill would continue to function as an instrument of compliance. Those who resisted or remembered too clearly were marginalized, ignored, or intimidated. The truth existed, but it was buried beneath layers of sanctioned stories, bureaucratic obfuscation, and the town's own conditioned perception. Institutions were complicit. Clergy, law enforcement, and educators all participated, often unconsciously, in maintaining the illusion. They reinforced what the mill had already taught. Do not question. Do not pry. Trust the system. And when a system trains its participants to obey without reflection, even those sworn to protect the vulnerable become tools of the agenda. This is the hidden lesson Blackwater Mill offers to anyone who studies it closely. Control is not only about direct action, it is about shaping belief, memory, and consent, so that compliance becomes internalized and unquestioned. Even decades later, whispers persist. Researchers who examine the archives notice missing pages, anomalies in census records, and strange correspondence between the mill's owners and distant authorities. But the story remains officially unsolved. Why? Because some truths are too powerful to acknowledge openly. Revealing them would not only expose historical crimes, but also the underlying mechanisms of control that are still in play today. Systems that manipulate perception, behavior, and memory are not relics of the past. They are active, adaptive, and invisible. The lesson here is urgent and personal. If you believe that institutions, traditions, or daily routines are neutral, you are mistaken. Power operates quietly, invisibly, shaping your decisions, your beliefs, and even your sense of reality. Blackwater Mill demonstrates the ultimate consequence of this quiet control. Lives erased, histories rewritten, obedience weaponized. And if you want to understand it, you must first admit the terrifying truth. You have been part of similar systems your entire life, molded in ways you rarely notice. The children who disappeared that day were never simply missing. They had been conditioned to respond to the mill's hidden rhythms, to move in accordance with invisible cues, and to internalize obedience so completely that their actions became automatic. By the time they were led into the underground chambers, they were no longer just children. They were instruments, fine-tuned for extraction. Those who witnessed their departure described it as surreal. Small figures moving in perfect unison, faces devoid of fear or hesitation, as if they were following a command written into their very being. What happened next is harder to describe. Some who explored the labyrinth decades later reported an unsettling resonance, a lingering energy that seemed to echo the children's steps long after they had vanished. This is consistent with ancient practices, where physical spaces were engineered to store and amplify the psychological state of those who passed through them. The mill's underground chambers were not just rooms, they were memory traps, recordings of obedience, behavioral blueprints, and psychic imprints. Those blueprints were the culmination of decades of training and subtle conditioning, designed to ensure that compliance would continue indefinitely. Psychologically, this is profound. The children had been stripped of independent choice, replaced with instinctive obedience. Their minds were shaped to anticipate commands, respond instantly, and integrate authority into every thought. And this was not violence. It was more insidious. It was a quiet removal of agency, a transformation so complete that it became invisible. To the untrained eye, the children had vanished. To the system, they had been perfected. This is the first dangerous truth you must face. Control of the human mind is not about force. It is about preparation, manipulation, and environment. Blackwater Mill is a chilling proof of that principle. Its lessons extend beyond that town, beyond time, and into every structure, system, and hierarchy that governs human behavior. Those who fail to recognize it are doomed to be influenced, guided, and shaped without even knowing it. And here's where it becomes personal. By learning the mechanisms of Blackwater Mill, by understanding how obedience is manufactured, you awaken a part of yourself that has been dormant. You begin to see patterns, hierarchies, and rhythms in your own life that quietly dictate your choices. Awareness is the first step toward mastery. But it is also a dangerous one, because once you see the system, it cannot be unseen. The architects of Blackwater Mill did not vanish with the children. They were part of networks older than the town itself, hidden societies that passed knowledge of influence, rhythm, and control through generations. Their goal was never simply wealth or power in the conventional sense. It was mastery, over minds, over perception, over entire populations. The mill was a prototype, a laboratory where methods could be refined, tested, and perfected before being applied on a larger scale. These men understood something most will never admit: influence is more powerful than force. Violence can bend a body, but control can bend the will. And control, once achieved, is self-perpetuating. A society that believes it acts freely, that thinks it is autonomous, is easier to shape than one governed by fear. Blackwater Mill demonstrated this principle perfectly. Children conditioned over years obeyed without resistance. Adults complicit in routines reinforced the system for them. Authorities, unwittingly or willingly, legitimized it. Every layer of the town became a mechanism of governance, invisible and absolute. And the reach of these networks extended far beyond Blackwater. The families who profited from the mill had connections to industrial conglomerates, academic institutions, and political bodies. Letters discovered decades later hint at correspondence with other labs of obedience, locations where the same principles were applied in schools, factories, and orphanages. These weren't isolated experiments. They were part of a global architecture of influence. The disappearance of the children was a demonstration, a message, a proof of concept. It was a blueprint for systemic control that could be replicated anyway. Understanding this is uncomfortable. You realize that the systems we trust, education, governance, even social structures, are built with tools that can manipulate behavior, enforce compliance, and suppress dissent without anyone noticing. And that is the danger. The methods of Blackwater Mill are not historical relics. They are alive today, embedded in every hierarchy, every institution, every structure that relies on routine, expectation, and habit. They persist because they are subtle, invisible, and unchallenged. And here's the moment to internalize it. The story of Blackwater Mill is not just a tale of vanished children. It is a mirror held up to our world. Every schedule, every rule, every necessary structure is potentially a tool for obedience. Every system you participate in may be shaping your choices, your beliefs, and your perception of reality. Recognition is the first step toward freedom. And the men who designed Blackwater Mill understood this better than anyone in history. The power of Blackwater Mill lay not only in its walls or its machinery, but in its language, a language hidden in plain sight, embedded in rituals, symbols, and patterns. Every bell chime, every swing of a pendulum, every rotation of a gear carried meaning beyond the obvious. To the untrained eye, these were ordinary sounds and motions. To the children, conditioned over years, they were instructions, cues, and prompts. The mill spoke in a code that only those within its rhythm could understand, a code designed to shape behavior before any conscious thought could intervene. The layout of the town reinforced the message. Streets aligned with the rise and fall of the sun, windows framed specific angles of light at specific times, and school schedules synchronized with the machinery of the mill. Even communal meals and church gatherings were orchestrated to reinforce rhythm, obedience, and expectation. In subtle ways, the system trained perception itself, teaching that compliance was natural, inevitable, and necessary. Deviate, and your mind, and eventually your body, would correct itself without the need for punishment. Rituals amplified this power. Weekly inspections, precise clock adjustments, and public exercises were not ceremonial fluff. They were deliberate exercises in alignment, conditioning the town to operate as a single organism. Adults unknowingly performed these rituals, reinforcing the same patterns that had been instilled in their children. Authority was encoded as routine. Obedience became instinct. By the time the disappearance occurred, the system was complete. The children did not flee, because they had been trained to flow into the hidden chambers as naturally as water into the mill's channels. There is a lesson here that applies far beyond Blackwater Mill. Control is most effective when it is invisible, when it becomes part of the rhythm of life itself. When patterns, routines, and rituals shape behavior subtly, resistance becomes almost impossible. Systems like this do not announce themselves. They exist in shadows, in daily schedules, in seemingly ordinary habits. And once you recognize them, You understand why entire populations can act in ways that serve power without ever realizing it. The children of Blackwater Mill were instruments of this design. Their minds, molded over years, were ready to respond to invisible prompts, to enter spaces that adults could not comprehend, and to disappear in a moment engineered to be complete and irreversible. And for those who study this carefully, the warning is clear: these forces do not die. They only lie dormant, waiting for environments where the same rhythms, routines, and rituals can be applied again. The adults of Blackwater Mill were perhaps the most fascinating and terrifying victims of the system. Their passivity was not born of ignorance or fear. It was the result of subtle, decades-long conditioning. Perception itself had been manipulated. They saw events unfold but interpreted them through the lens of expectation the mill had instilled. When clocks stopped, they assumed malfunction. When children paused mid-step or whispered to invisible presences, they assumed imagination or fatigue. Their brains had been trained to rationalize the impossible, to filter out anomalies, and to accept the narrative the system required. Memory, too, was a tool of control. Witnesses reported discrepancies, details would fade, sequences would blur, and significant moments, like the exact second the children vanished, became hazy. But this was not natural forgetting. The mill's environment, the synchronized routines, and the psychological pressure had literally shaped cognition. Adults could recall events, but only in ways that maintained the system's authority. The mind becomes compliant when it cannot trust its own recollection, when every memory is filtered through expectation rather than observation. This is how obedience is maintained without chains. Even the strongest instincts, the protective urge toward one's child, were neutralized. Parents watched their children vanish, yet did not resist in the way one would expect. Shock explained some of it, but the deeper mechanism was anticipation. Children trained to follow the system, adults trained to defer judgment, the town conditioned to accept events as necessary or unexplainable. It is here that Blackwater Mill demonstrates the terrifying efficacy of structural control. Autonomy can be eroded without violence, authority can be enforced without law, and obedience can be embedded so deeply that even instinct fails to disrupt it. What emerges from this is a larger truth, one that transcends the specific horrors of the mill. Systems of influence work best when their power is invisible, unquestioned, and integrated into the daily lives of those they govern. Every rule, every routine, every ritual in the town served a dual purpose, managing immediate behavior while silently reinforcing long-term compliance. And when the children disappeared, the adults were not traumatized so much as conditioned to accept a new equilibrium, a reality in which authority could move unseen and unchallenged. Recognizing this pattern is critical, because once you understand that perception, memory, and routine can be orchestrated to bend entire populations, you begin to see the same forces at work in the world around you. And that awareness is the beginning of awakening, a dangerous, irreversible descent into understanding that few are prepared to face. The disappearance of the children was not chaotic. It was an act of algorithmic precision, a process orchestrated with the same meticulous planning as the mill's machinery. Every step had been anticipated, every response predicted, every path calculated. The system had been trained over decades, conditioning both the children and the adults to behave in ways that ensured the extraction would be complete and uncontested. It was not luck. It was design. The children followed cues embedded in their daily lives: bell chimes, the rotation of machinery, shifts in light, and subtle gestures from authority figures. These signals, imperceptible to untrained observers, guided them into the subterranean labyrinth beneath the mill. There, the environment itself, a combination of architecture, sound, and light, continued the conditioning, reinforcing obedience, focus, and compliance. By the time they reached the final chamber, they were fully synchronized with the system, functioning as if the extraction had always been their purpose. Adults perceived only fragments. Some saw shadows move where no one was present. Others reported hearing whispers and footsteps, but assumed imagination. Their conditioned perception filtered out the impossible, preserving the narrative the system required. Time, already weaponized through synchronized clocks, amplified this effect. Every second was structured to reinforce expectation, to suppress doubt, and to maintain authority. By the end, the town believed the children had vanished mysteriously, when in reality, every element had been controlled and executed with exactitude. The broader implication is chilling. When a system understands both environment and human psychology, it can orchestrate outcomes that seem miraculous, random, or tragic, while actually being entirely deterministic. Blackwater Mill is a template for such manipulation, a warning that control need not be overt to be absolute. By structuring experience, perception, and habit, those in power can engineer behavior in ways that escape conscious detection. Here is the hard truth. The disappearance was a demonstration, a message. It proved that minds can be aligned, that behavior can be predicted, and that obedience can be extracted without chains, force, or threat. And for those willing to see it, it shows that the architecture of control exists all around us, waiting for opportunities to bend perception, erode autonomy, and shape life itself. Once you understand this, you can no longer view the world as neutral. You recognize the invisible algorithms in play, and the potential to either resist or become complicit. The children of Blackwater Mill did not simply vanish, they left a legacy woven into the very fabric of the town. Years later, townspeople reported subtle changes in behavior among those who remained, patterns that echoed the precision and obedience that had been instilled in the missing. Families unconsciously adopted new routines, work shifted with uncanny synchronization, and even the simplest decisions seemed guided by invisible forces. It was as if the extraction had left behind a residual algorithm, one that continued to shape lives long after the immediate event. This is the mark of true systemic control. Its influence persists beyond its direct targets. The children had been instruments of compliance, but the adults became instruments of reinforcement. Without realizing it, the town was retraining itself, internalizing the rules, routines, and expectations the mill had engineered. Observers decades later noticed anomalies in memory, narrative, and even the geography of recollection. Streets remembered differently, events reordered subconsciously, and conversations altered by expectation rather than fact. Blackwater Mill's lessons had been internalized, encoded in perception itself. And there's a darker implication here. Control, once perfected, becomes self-propagating. The town no longer required direct oversight, it enforced the system autonomously. Authority had been internalized to the point that compliance became instinct, and obedience persisted across generations. This is why those who study Blackwater Mill in detail describe it as a living organism, a system that evolves, adapts, and maintains itself without overt coercion. What happened to the children was only the catalyst. The real power was the enduring influence, the quiet shaping of an entire community to conform to invisible directives. The echoes of Blackwater Mill extend beyond its physical location. Scholars, researchers, and conspiratorial observers have traced similar patterns in modern systems. Schools, workplaces, even digital platforms that subtly nudge behavior, enforce compliance, and reshape attention. The same principles, conditioning, environmental control, and structural manipulation, apply, proving that the methods perfected in that mill have never truly disappeared. They have merely adapted to new contexts, new technologies, and new forms of influence. This is the lesson you must internalize. Blackwater Mill was more than a historical anomaly. It was a demonstration of the mechanics of obedience, the architecture of compliance, and the persistence of systemic control. Understanding it is both dangerous and liberating. Dangerous, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Liberating, because knowledge of these mechanisms is the first step toward mastery, the ability to recognize, resist, and potentially reclaim autonomy from the forces that shape perception, belief, and behavior without your awareness. Time at Blackwater Mill was never innocent. Clocks were everywhere, in homes, schools, factories, and churches, but they did more than mark hours. They dictated rhythm, expectation, and compliance. The synchronous ticking of hundreds of identical timepieces created a pulse, a heartbeat that both children and adults unconsciously followed. Those who deviated from it felt unease, disorientation, or subtle anxiety. Time itself became an instrument, a silent overseer ensuring that behavior conformed to the system's hidden agenda. The stopping of every clock at 9:17 a.m. was the ultimate demonstration of this power. It was not mechanical failure, but a command, a synchronized activation that triggered the children's training and confirmed the town's conditioning. Adults watched, perplexed and powerless, as an invisible order moved through the population. The stopping of time proved what had long been rehearsed. Obedience could be extracted without violence, perception could be manipulated, and the rhythm of life itself could be weaponized. Ritual reinforced this control. Weekly inspections, public exercises, bell chimes, and synchronized tasks embedded the authority of the system into daily life. The town had been trained to anticipate and accept instructions, even when they were invisible. The clocks were not merely devices, they were signals, anchors, and triggers. Every rotation of a hand reinforced expectation, internalized discipline, and acceptance of hierarchy. The environment, over decades, had become a psychological tool, a silent framework for obedience that few noticed until it was too late. Understanding this requires a subtle shift in perspective. We often assume power resides in force, in overt dominance. Blackwater Mill proves otherwise. Real power is invisible. It lies in the manipulation of perception, the orchestration of routine, and the weaponization of environment. It is silent, subtle, and nearly impossible to resist once the system has been internalized. Time itself becomes a master, teaching submission through the rhythm of daily life. And this is the truth few dare to confront. The architecture of control exists everywhere. Schedules, rituals, routines, and repeated symbols are not neutral, they are instruments. And if a small town in 1927 could be shaped so completely, imagine what similar systems can achieve today, in schools, corporations, governments, and even digital platforms. Blackwater Mill is not only history, it is a lesson, a warning, and a mirror reflecting the invisible forces that govern human behavior. The children of Blackwater Mill were conditioned to respond to signals invisible to everyone else. Every sound, every flicker of light, every subtle shift in motion became a cue. A bell's chime might signal pause. A shadow sliding across a wall might prompt movement. The rhythm of the mill, the grinding of gears, the hum of water, even the vibrations beneath the floor, acted as a language only they could understand. These cues were drilled over years, turning instinct into obedience, anticipation into action. By the time the day of the disappearance arrived, every child moved as if guided by an unseen conductor. This was not hypnosis. It was patterning, classical conditioning on a mass scale. Rewards and subtle feedback embedded into daily life taught the children to internalize authority. Praise, encouragement, attention, all were contingent upon alignment with expectation. Deviance, even minor, was gently corrected through social and environmental cues rather than punishment. The system trained the mind to anticipate commands before they were explicitly given, creating reflexive compliance. In other words, obedience became instinctual. Even the environment was designed to reinforce control. Light shifted in hallways to guide the children, doors were constructed to channel movement, and floors were subtly sloped or textured to influence direction. Sound was used strategically. The creak of stairs, the rhythm of distant machinery, even whispered voices carried through hidden ducts, each carefully calibrated to direct attention and action. These were invisible threads, weaving the children into a network of predictability the adults could not perceive. And the adults, conditioned over decades, became part of the mechanism. Their routines, behaviors, and unquestioning acceptance reinforced the cues, ensuring the children followed seamlessly. Obedience was encoded both in environment and social structure. When the moment arrived, the extraction was total, precise, and unresisted. It was a demonstration of absolute control, achieved without force, without fear, and without the need for coercion. This is the dangerous truth. Human behavior can be orchestrated so subtly that compliance becomes reflex, perception becomes malleable, and freedom disappears without anyone noticing. Blackwater Mill shows what happens when conditioning, environment, and social reinforcement converge. And it is a pattern that repeats, everywhere, all the time, in ways few ever recognize. The real power at Blackwater Mill never rested in machinery or bricks. It rested in the invisible hierarchy of its operators. These were men who never appeared in public records, who gave no interviews, who left no trace except in the meticulous alignment of behavior around them. They were the conductors of a hidden orchestra, orchestrating human action with the precision of engineers and the insight of psychologists. Every bell chime, every clock adjustment, every shift schedule was a note in a composition designed to produce obedience, predictability, and control. Authority, in this system, was absolute because it was invisible. The children did not follow a person, they followed cues embedded in the environment. Adults complied not because of fear, but because the hierarchy had been internalized over decades. Clocks, teachers, parents, and ministers all became instruments, unknowingly reinforcing the structure that ensured obedience. The operators of Blackwater Mill had mastered the principle that power is strongest when it is unrecognized, when it acts through layers rather than direct intervention. These men also understood anticipation, predicting behavior, preempting resistance, and orchestrating outcomes before anyone realized a choice was being made. They were strategists, planners, and psychologists in one, applying ancient knowledge of rhythm, environment, and suggestion. Every element of the town, from church bells to the positioning of benches in classrooms, was optimized to guide attention and action. The disappearance of the children was not improvised. It was the execution of decades-long planning, with every adult, every habit, and every machine operating as part of the design. And this is what makes the story of Blackwater Mill more than a tragedy. It is a lesson in the architecture of control. The operators never needed to enforce obedience overtly because they had already structured it into perception, memory, and expectation. Authority became embedded in the environment itself, in routines, in rituals, and in the collective psychology of the town. Resistance, when it appeared, was anticipated and neutralized before it could manifest. Once you grasp this principle, you see its echoes everywhere. Every system that relies on routine, repetition, and hierarchy can achieve similar results, shaping behavior invisibly. And the men who ran Blackwater Mill understood this with chilling clarity. They demonstrated that control is most powerful when it cannot be seen, felt, or even consciously recognized, but its effects are absolute. Fear at Blackwater Mill was never explicit. There were no threats, no punishments, no chains. Instead, it was anticipation, subtle tension, the quiet pressure of expectation that taught compliance. The town had been conditioned to follow patterns, internalize authority, and trust the rhythm of the mill over intuition. Anxiety became a tool, embedded in everyday life, guiding behavior without anyone realizing they were being controlled. Even the adults, trained for decades, felt unease when routines were disrupted, an instinctive nudge toward conformity. Children experienced this on a deeper level. Years of subtle cues, bell chimes, shifts in machinery, whispered instructions, created a psychological lattice, a structure within which fear was not imposed but anticipated. Deviation became uncomfortable, obedience became instinctive. The mind itself learned to act before the command was explicit. This is the principle of anticipatory compliance, control so precise that resistance is impossible because the individual has been conditioned to expect and yield to authority automatically. The environment reinforced this. Shadows, light, temperature, and sound were manipulated to maintain subtle tension. Hallways directed movement, rooms were designed to create expectation, and even the rotation of gears acted as a subconscious guide. Every element reminded the mind that there was a pattern, a rhythm, an order, and that deviation was dangerous, not in the sense of punishment, but in the sense of discomfort, unease, and instinctive correction. Fear, in this system, was quiet but absolute. This is the terrifying lesson Blackwater Mill imparts. The most effective obedience is not compelled by brute force, but cultivated through anticipation and subtle environmental pressure. The children vanished not because they were forced, but because the system had prepared them to respond perfectly. The adults remained passive not because they were ignorant, but because their minds were conditioned to rationalize and accept. Compliance was embedded, anticipation became instinct, and fear itself became a tool of invisible mastery. And here's what you need to internalize. The principles at work in Blackwater Mill are not unique to that town or that era. Any environment can be structured to shape perception, behavior, and obedience. Fear, anticipation, and expectation, when wielded with precision, can bend reality without anyone noticing. Once you understand this, you see the invisible architecture of control everywhere, in ways that are subtle, systematic, and inescapable. Now, let us take a step further, into the point where knowledge becomes action. There is a symbolic ritual I want you to participate in. It is simple, but it has weight. Repeat this phrase silently or aloud, twice. I see the unseen, I follow no master. Say it once, feel it resonate in your mind. Then say it again, embedding it deeper. This is not superstition. This is recognition. Recognition that systems of control exist all around you, shaping behavior, perception, and belief. Recognition that obedience can be engineered, even in ways you never imagined. By repeating the phrase, you are locking in awareness. You are engaging not just your conscious mind, but the layers of perception and attention that usually operate unseen. Systems like Blackwater Mill thrive on passivity. Knowledge becomes dangerous when it is acted upon. This phrase is your first act of conscious resistance. You are aligning your focus, sharpening your perception, and acknowledging that you no longer accept reality at face value. Understand this. The symbolic act mirrors what the children of Blackwater Mill were trained to do in reverse. Where they were conditioned to obey invisible commands, you are now conditioning yourself to perceive and resist them. This is your first step toward mastery, toward awareness that is active rather than passive. Every repetition strengthens recognition, trains attention, and fortifies your capacity to discern invisible forces at play. And the timing of this is deliberate. By the midpoint of our descent into the story, you are no longer merely a witness. You are a participant. You are aligning your mind with the knowledge being revealed. The system the mill created relied on repetition, expectation, and environmental cues. You are now using the same principles for autonomy, for understanding, for reclaiming control. Awareness is dangerous, but power grows with it. Remember, this is only the beginning. Blackwater Mill's lessons extend far beyond the town, far beyond the vanished children, far beyond the clocks that stopped. This symbolic act is your acknowledgement that you see the mechanisms at work, that you recognize authority disguised as routine, and that you are preparing yourself to operate beyond it. Repeat it. I see the unseen. I follow no master. Twice. Commit it to memory. Feel the transformation begin. Once you have internalized the symbolic phrase, you begin to see the patterns beyond Blackwater Mill itself. The principles that shaped those children, that conditioned entire families, and that orchestrated obedience through invisible cues, are not confined to a single town or century. They are timeless. They appear wherever power seeks to control, influence, or predict human behavior. Schools, corporations, governments, digital platforms, and even social networks. The architecture of compliance has simply evolved. The methods have adapted, but the core principles remain identical. What the mill achieved through clocks, shadows, and machinery is now accomplished through algorithms, schedules, and expectation. Attention is guided without overt command. Decisions are subtly nudged by design. Behavioral patterns are observed, analyzed, and predicted. In every system, there is a hidden rhythm, an unseen hierarchy, and invisible cues that shape perception and action. The lesson is uncomfortable. Humans are remarkably pliable when environments, routines, and expectations are engineered with precision. Blackwater Mill is simply an extreme example, but it proves the universal principle. Consider how subtly this occurs. Repetition, reinforcement, and anticipation are more powerful than threat or punishment. Control can be embedded in daily life, taught over time, and reinforced without anyone consciously realizing it. The children were instruments of this knowledge, the adults unwitting enforcers. In modern systems, the same principle applies. Participation in routine, expectation of instruction, and subconscious adherence to cues ensure compliance long before overt power is exercised. The mechanism is invisible, yet the effect is absolute. By recognizing this, you awaken to the architecture of influence that surrounds you. Every expectation, habit, and routine in your life can now be scrutinized for hidden intent. Every instruction, overt or subtle, becomes something to analyze. This is the awakening Blackwater Mill was never meant to provoke. Awareness that the world is structured to shape thought, that obedience can be orchestrated, and that autonomy must be claimed deliberately. And the final truth emerges here. Knowledge alone is insufficient. Seeing the patterns is dangerous, but action is what transforms danger into power. Understanding the mechanisms of control is the first step, but recognizing where they operate in your own life is what allows you to reclaim authority over perception, behavior, and ultimately, freedom. The children of Blackwater Mill were never truly gone. They had been transformed into living instruments of the system, molded so precisely that their minds became extensions of the mill's invisible design. The extraction was only the first step. What followed was a lifelong imprint of obedience, rhythm, and anticipation. Though the public saw disappearance, the truth is far more unsettling. They carried the conditioning into every interaction, every decision, and every environment they entered afterward. The agency was overwritten by patterns meticulously instilled over years, a living echo of the mill's architecture of control. This legacy was not limited to themselves. The children's influence subtly radiated outward, reinforcing the very system that had created them. Their behavior, synchronized and predictable, shaped social dynamics, teaching peers and family members to comply, to anticipate, and to accept authority without question. They became silent conduits of the same invisible hierarchy that had orchestrated their removal, carrying forward a structure of control that extended beyond the mill's walls. Every smile, every gesture, every carefully timed reaction became part of a broader psychological network designed to propagate obedience. Consider the implication. The most effective power is that which spreads invisibly, influencing not only its immediate targets but everyone they encounter. The children were the first generation of what we might call living algorithms, human beings designed to operate predictably, whose behavior reinforced systemic authority. And while the adults remained unwittingly compliant, the children became both proof of concept and vehicle for the system's ongoing influence. Control had become self-sustaining, evolving across interactions, generations, and contexts. Psychologically, this is profound. We often assume influence requires direct force or coercion. Blackwater Mill proves the opposite. Subtle conditioning, environmental control, and behavioral reinforcement can yield obedience so deep that it persists across time and space, extending beyond immediate circumstances. Once internalized, the patterns of control can continue to operate invisibly, shaping thought and action without overt direction. The children were living proof of this, and their impact lingered far beyond what any observer could perceive. And this is the lesson you must confront. Systems of influence are not neutral. They operate silently, invisibly, and persistently. Once you recognize the mechanisms, the question becomes, will you remain a passive conduit, shaped and guided, or will you awaken, see the patterns, and reclaim autonomy over your mind, your actions, and your reality? The authority of Blackwater Mill was invisible, yet absolute. It did not rely on force, persuasion, or threats. It relied on expectation, rhythm, and internalized belief. Adults complied without question, children followed instinctively, and the town itself became a mechanism of enforcement. This is the principle that power rarely admits. True control operates silently, through perception, environment, and social conditioning. Those who do not recognize it are already participants in it, unaware of the invisible hierarchy guiding every decision and reaction. This invisible authority extended beyond the mill itself. Letters, financial records, and subtle correspondences suggest the operators were connected to networks far larger than anyone suspected. Schools, religious institutions, and civic organizations all mirrored the same principles: repetition, ritual, and subtle environmental control. The extraction of the children was a demonstration, a proof that the methods worked, and a template for replication. Authority had no face, no name. It existed in the system itself, embedded in habits, schedules, and expectations. Generations after the disappearance, the principles persisted. The town's routines, social hierarchies, and behavioral norms continued to reinforce compliance. Even those who never experienced the mill directly were shaped by the echoes of its influence. This is the danger and brilliance of invisible authority. Once internalized, it self-perpetuates. Obedience becomes instinctive, resistance becomes uncomfortable, and deviation triggers subconscious correction. The system does not require oversight because its participants enforce it automatically. Recognizing invisible authority is not optional, it is survival. Those who study Blackwater Mill and similar systems learn that power is not always exercised through visible means. It moves through rhythm, repetition, expectation, and anticipation. The same mechanisms operate in workplaces, educational systems, governments, and digital platforms today. Awareness is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy, the first step toward resisting a pattern of influence designed to operate unnoticed and unchecked. And here is the unavoidable truth. Once you understand invisible authority, you cannot return to ignorance. You begin to perceive the rhythms, the cues, the hidden hierarchies shaping every environment you inhabit. Recognition is dangerous, but it is also empowering. Awareness transforms observation into mastery, enabling you to act rather than react, to perceive rather than comply, and to reclaim freedom where systems once dictated behavior without notice. The clocks, the gears, The routines at Blackwater Mill were not mere tools of industry. They were instruments of ritualized control. Each bell, each turn of a wheel, each scheduled task was a signal, a subtle guide to behavior, a message that shaped perception and expectation. The children responded instinctively, adults reinforced unconsciously, and the system operated like a living organism. This was not coincidence. It was deliberate design. Time itself had become a weapon. The daily schedules were orchestrated to instill anticipation, alignment, and compliance. Meals, work shifts, school lessons, and playtime were not neutral. They were exercises in obedience, rehearsing behavior in a way that became automatic. Even pauses and breaks were scripted, teaching attention and rhythm. By embedding authority in every movement, every moment, the mill's operators ensured that resistance was almost impossible. Obedience was no longer optional. It was encoded into the very experience of life. Machinery reinforced the message. Large gears and grinding wheels produced sound, vibration, and movement that the children learned to interpret as cues. Shadows and light patterns became signals, subtle prompts for action. These environmental cues acted like invisible teachers, guiding behavior without anyone consciously noticing. The children, conditioned over years, responded flawlessly. The adults, conditioned for decades, validated the system without realizing it. Together, they created a feedback loop, a self-reinforcing mechanism of compliance that extended beyond the mill itself. The ritualistic nature of these elements is striking. It mirrors practices from ancient civilizations, where architecture, rhythm, and repetition were used to shape perception, influence thought, and enforce hierarchy. Blackwater Mill was a modern echo, a place where machinery and ritual converged to produce obedience, anticipation, and alignment. Every rotation of a wheel, every tick of a clock, every scheduled action was a brushstroke in a larger design, a design that demanded compliance without overt coercion. Understanding this changes how you perceive authority. The most absolute control does not rely on force. It relies on environment, ritual, and expectation. It embeds itself in perception and memory, shaping behavior long before any explicit command is issued. Blackwater Mill is the ultimate demonstration, a system where time, machinery, and routine became instruments of psychological mastery, bending human will in ways subtle, powerful, and invisible. Blackwater Mill did not exist in isolation. Beneath its walls, behind the gears and the shadows, there were networks, hidden correspondences linking the operators to forces far beyond the town. Letters, ledgers, and cryptic messages discovered decades later reveal a web of communication with financiers, academics, and secretive organizations that understood the same principles of human control. The mill was a node in a larger system, a proof of concept demonstrating the precision and power of invisible authority. These correspondences are chilling in their clarity. They describe methods of conditioning, timing, and environmental manipulation as if they were mathematical formulas. The mill was not merely a factory. It was a laboratory for human behavior, a testing ground for techniques that could be applied on a broader scale. Each report documented outcomes, lessons learned, and subtle refinements to methods. The operators were not isolated madmen. They were practitioners, connected to a lineage of knowledge that extended across continents and centuries. The networks ensured the longevity and propagation of the mill's influence. Knowledge, once perfected, was shared discreetly, with instructions on replication in other contexts. Schools, institutions, and industrial operations could adopt the same principles. Structured routines, environmental cues, ritualized schedules, and anticipatory conditioning. Blackwater Mill was not an anomaly. It was a model, a demonstration of systemic power that could be adapted and implemented anyway. The disappearances were proof of principle, a silent message to those within the network that the methods worked. This is where the danger becomes personal. The same principles that govern Blackwater Mill are alive today, embedded in institutions, corporations, and social systems. Invisible hierarchies, environmental cues, and ritualized routines continue to guide behavior, shape perception, and enforce compliance. Understanding this is not abstract, it is urgent. Once you perceive these networks, you recognize the mechanisms operating in your own life, the invisible structures influencing decisions, habits, and beliefs without your conscious awareness. The lesson is unavoidable. Systems of power are far older and more sophisticated than you may imagine. They are designed to operate in shadows, to embed authority in routine and perception, and to propagate themselves across time and space. Blackwater Mill is a warning. Mastery of these systems belongs to those who understand them, and resistance begins with recognition. The final moments of the children's extraction were executed with a precision that borders on the supernatural. Every movement, every step, every glance had been rehearsed, not consciously, but through decades of conditioning. The underground labyrinth, the rhythm of the machinery above, the flickering lights, the subtle vibrations in the floor, each acted as a cue. The children did not hesitate, they did not falter, and they did not resist. They moved as if guided by an invisible hand, a living algorithm of obedience. This was the culmination of decades of psychological engineering. Anticipatory compliance, environmental conditioning, and ritualized reinforcement converged in a moment of perfect execution. The adults, conditioned to rationalize anomalies, witnessed the vanishing but perceived only mystery. They had been trained to accept the impossible, to filter the extraordinary through expectation. By the time the last child passed through the final chamber, the system had proven its total efficacy: absolute obedience without coercion, compliance without force, and the erasure of resistance before it could emerge. The significance extends far beyond the mill. The extraction demonstrates the mechanics of systemic control in action, how perception, memory, and routine can be engineered to produce predictable behavior, how fear and anticipation can guide compliance, and how invisible hierarchies can orchestrate events with absolute precision. It is a chilling illustration of the power of preparation, conditioning, and environmental mastery over even the most human instincts. And here's the truth most fail to recognize: the principles that orchestrated the disappearance are replicable. They exist in any system that understands rhythm, expectation, and perception. The children were not anomalies, they were proof of concept. The mill was not an isolated event, it was a template. Every aspect of the extraction, from cues to movement to environmental reinforcement, can be mirrored wherever power seeks to shape behavior invisibly. This is the lesson that resonates today. Control is rarely overt. The most profound systems of influence operate beneath awareness, manipulating attention, shaping perception, and directing behavior without overt force. Blackwater Mill exposes the mechanics of mastery, demonstrating that obedience can be engineered, authority internalized, and autonomy erased, all under the guise of ordinary routine, expectation, and environment. The aftermath of Blackwater Mill was as quiet as the extraction itself, yet its effects were profound and enduring. The town did not collapse into chaos. Instead, it continued on with a surface-level normalcy that concealed deep psychological shifts. Adults unconsciously reinforced the patterns established over decades. Routines became stricter, rituals more rigid, and attention to invisible cues sharpened. The disappearance of the children had altered collective perception, embedding a subtle tension that guided behavior without overt awareness. The psychological imprint was multigenerational. Parents who had been conditioned reinforced the same patterns in their remaining children. Habits, expectations, and social norms were subtly recalibrated to maintain order, perpetuating compliance without anyone realizing the force that guided them. Even memories were manipulated, not through deceit, but through perception and expectation. Witnesses recalled events differently over time, gaps appeared in recollection, and the extraordinary became mundane. The system had created a self-sustaining mechanism, authority embedded in perception, compliance encoded in memory, and obedience propagated silently through daily life. What is most terrifying is how easily these lessons translate to other contexts. Blackwater Mill demonstrates that power is most effective when it is invisible, structural, and psychological. It is not brute force that guarantees obedience. It is repetition, expectation, and environmental influence. Once internalized, the system enforces itself. This is the pattern that repeats across institutions, organizations, and societies. The same techniques used to shape the town continue to operate in subtle forms today, guiding behavior, controlling perception, and shaping decisions without anyone realizing they are participating. The town became both a laboratory and a demonstration. The disappearance was the immediate event, but the real experiment was the persistence of influence. Generations later, the echoes of the mill's conditioning remained embedded in rhythm, ritual, and perception. Authority had become invisible, obedience internalized, and freedom a concept quietly eroded by decades of unseen control. This is the hard truth Blackwater Mill offers. Systems of influence are not confined to history. They are active, adaptive, and persistent. Awareness is not passive observation. It is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy. Recognizing the invisible structures of control and understanding how they shape perception and behavior is essential if you wish to resist being an unwitting participant in someone else's system. The lessons of Blackwater Mill are not confined to the past. They are alive today, operating invisibly in ways most people never notice. Schedules, routines, social expectations, digital platforms, and institutional norms all replicate the same principles: anticipation, environmental cues, repetition, and subtle conditioning. Obedience can be engineered without threat, compliance can be extracted without overt instruction, and perception can be guided without conscious awareness. The mill was a prototype, and its techniques are embedded in modern life. Understanding this requires courage. Most people assume autonomy is a given, that thought and action are independent. Blackwater Mill proves otherwise. Systems of control can be quiet, invisible, and even benevolent in appearance, yet they bend behavior, perception, and memory toward a predetermined outcome. The patterns are subtle: a carefully timed notification, a sequence of events in a workplace, or even the architecture of a city can function as a behavioral cue, conditioning decisions before conscious thought intervenes. Awareness is the only defense. You now know the first rule of modern mastery: recognition. Identify the cues, the rituals, the invisible hierarchies that shape your environment. Notice how your decisions are guided by expectation rather than choice. Ask why routines exist, who benefits from them, and what instincts are being manipulated. Blackwater Mill shows that the most effective authority is silent, persistent, and internalized. Resistance begins by seeing it. The second rule is engagement. Conscious awareness must be reinforced. Like the symbolic phrase, earlier, I see the unseen, I follow no master. Active recognition creates a counterrhythm, a disruption in the patterns that would otherwise shape behavior. Autonomy is a muscle, strengthened by repeated acknowledgement of unseen influence and deliberate intervention in everyday routines. The mill taught obedience. You can learn discernment. Finally, the third rule is application. Knowledge without action is vulnerability. Blackwater Mill demonstrates the cost of passivity, the erasure of agency, the quiet imposition of control. By applying awareness to your own life, questioning assumptions, and disrupting predictable patterns, you reclaim freedom that systems of influence are designed to erode. Understanding the mill is dangerous, yes, but it is also transformative. We reach the final layer of this descent, the point where knowledge becomes burden, where awareness transforms into responsibility. Blackwater Mill is not merely a story of vanished children or a haunted town. It is a blueprint for understanding power, influence, and obedience. It exposes the mechanisms that shape perception, manipulate memory, and orchestrate behavior in ways almost invisible to the conscious mind. What you have seen here is dangerous because it is real, and because it reveals forces still active today. The vanished children, the synchronized clocks, the invisible operators, the self-reinforcing routines, they were all part of a system designed to achieve perfect compliance without violence. And the system succeeded. It teaches a principle that echoes far beyond 1927. Autonomy is fragile, freedom can be engineered away, and perception is always under influence. Those who fail to recognize these structures remain instruments of control, even if they believe themselves independent. Blackwater Mill proves that obedience is most absolute when it is internalized, invisible, and unquestioned. You have also witnessed the mechanisms of resistance, the awakening that begins with recognition. The symbolic phrase you repeated, the conscious attention to hidden cues, the understanding of rhythm, ritual, and expectation, all these are tools. They are the first acts of reclaiming autonomy. Awareness transforms the invisible into the perceivable. Knowledge transforms instinctive obedience into informed choice. And once you see the machinery, you cannot unsee it. This is the danger and the power of forbidden truth. The lesson is stark. Systems of control exist everywhere, in time, in space, in institutions, in technology, and in daily routines. Their principles are timeless: pattern, anticipation, reinforcement, and hierarchy. Blackwater Mill is only the most extreme, visible demonstration of a force that operates constantly in the background of modern life. To ignore it is to consent. To see it is to take the first step toward freedom. Now, take this knowledge seriously. Look around. Question routines, schedules, and instructions. Examine the invisible hierarchies guiding thought, perception, and action. Understand that mastery begins with perception, that autonomy requires vigilance, and that obedience can be disrupted, but only when you recognize it. Blackwater Mill was a warning, a demonstration, and a mirror. Its truth is clear. The world is structured, controlled, and engineered in ways most never perceive. And now, you see it. Forever,